brain begins to perceive that we're under some sort of life-threatening or physically severely dangerous condition, it kind of takes over. And so it provides all manner of chemicals into our bloodstream. We get adrenaline, we get epinephrine, we get norepinephrine, we get a lot of activation, so we get a lot of juice to be able to run away from the thing that's about to harm us or to destroy the thing or the person that's about to harm us. And so that creates an automatic physical action or a physical response inside that we have to do something about, meaning that's one of the things that causes people to wake up in nightmares is that they will go along and when they're reprocessing that event, when it gets to the part where it becomes life-threatening, their body, while they're sleeping, is going to start kicking in that fight or flight response. And so they get all those wonderful chemicals right there while they're asleep. And guess what? Boom, we're up and wide awake. So it can't be avoided. At least not initially anyway. A second major aspect of the experience is we get increased sensory registration, meaning in a traumatic event, as our body is on overdrive to try and protect us, it's taking in data through all of the senses available at warp speed. I like to make the analogy of it's kind of like the difference between being at an event with a single reflex camera. Do they still call them that? I don't even know. That's kind of an old word for cameras. But where you take a single picture of an event, that's kind of like what we would have with a normal memory versus taking a video of that same event. So as we take in information, we take it in at a much higher rate of speed, and we take in more data because it's life-threatening. And so even if the person at the time does not recognize all of that input gets stored and then comes up later for reprocessing. So folks will remember through the process of therapy parts of the event that they, up to that point, had not any conscious recollection of, even though the data was actually stored there. We get heightened emotions that are tied to the event, and what happens in nightmares and flashbacks is as the brain brings it up, we re-experience the very same emotions that were tied to the event, at least for a period of time, until we were able to start whittling them down. Because the problem is it's not that we're taking a video of it, but we're actually the camera. We're kind of a living camera, and that movie is inside us, and it affects us directly, and most of the time against our will, at least early on, until we can begin to manage it. Another major element is, we say, reduced cortical functioning. I really ought to change that word, because what in the word is a cortical? Right? To most people, they're like, what is that? But it's the inability to think, where a person feels like their brain is frozen. I actually had a baseball coach get into an altercation. He was the coach of one of my kids' teams when they were little, and he and our coaches got into a big row with the other team's coaches over some sort of a conflict they had on the field. Really great experience for parent modeling for kids. You know, there's out here these coaches punching each other and running around the field. So my wife got the kids out of the zone where the conflict was, and I was running over there trying to get my coach's attention to try and get him to stop. And I literally was about this far from the guy's face. I was jumping up and down, and I was yelling his name, and I was basically telling him, stop, stop, stop. What are you doing? He looked right through me. He didn't see me. He couldn't say anything because his mind was all around me, dealing with all of that. And he couldn't say a word. I kept saying, what are you doing? And he said nothing. And I thought, well, that was rude. Well, no, actually that was required. Left prefrontal cortex, a little part of the frontal lobe over here, goes offline when the fight or flight response kicks in. So when a person starts to re-experience that panic response, they're not going to be able to talk for a period of time. So how are you is a question that early on is going to not have an answer, because they have to be able to get their brain to kick back online, because all of the energy, all of the emotional chemical energy is going to survival structures. Our blood flow increases, our heart rate increases, our blood vessels will intermittently constrict and then dilate real big based on the kind of pressures that they're facing. The internal systems are going to evacuate anything that's available to evacuate so you can move faster, which is really not a very nice thing to talk about in a public seminar, but it does actually happen. And so all of that happens essentially because as a human organism, we are now in survival mode, not unlike the deer on the highway as it's trying to get across and ends up inadvertently running into our cars, is because they're not thinking. And in these moments, it's actually our body is kind of on autopilot. So, let's see here.
Then what do you want with me?
Berlin. Have you forgotten what happened in Berlin? You killed 2 people, Born. You killed 2 people. You killed 2 people.
Let him in.
Born.
I want to come in.
So, as this is happening, why is our brain doing this? I mean, why, after the fact, when we're outside of the danger zone, why is this occurring? Well, there's 2 basic reasons that this happens. The first one is protective. A flashback is really your brain's automatic survival system kicking on in a moment in time because it's been triggered by something in its present environment that says you might be in danger just like that. And then it brings up that just so you know exactly what kind of danger you might be in so that you know what sort of steps to take appropriately to survive. Now, obviously that sounds very logical, but this is highly disturbing to the person who's experiencing it because one minute they're walking down the sidewalk, maybe with their spouse, and then all of a sudden they're in a crowd of people and they have some flash of silver from the side and they start to look around. The next thing you know, they've left the area and they've found a dark corner of a little cafe somewhere and they're just sitting and their spouse is trying to figure out why they left and they don't want to talk about it because their brain basically said, you could be hurt like this again, so you've got to take action, okay? At night, nightmares, when we go into level 5 REM sleep, is also, we believe, the point when our brain is actually attempting to try and clean house. It's trying to take care of stress and stressors. It's trying to clean house physically, removing toxins and all manner of things. So with distressful events from the day, in level 5 REM sleep, what seems to happen is the brain tries to work out the distress. It's kind of like, for smaller situations, if you go to sleep and you're thinking about a problem and you're kind of upset about it, and then next morning all of a sudden you wake up and you've got the answer to that problem, well, that seems to happen in level 5 REM sleep because your brain is trying to process out the things that are disturbing. So the nightmares are actually tied to a process that's supposed to be healing and calming, but the problem is that based on the severity of the situation that the person's been in and the contribution of the fight or flight chemicals and the emotional disturbance, they're not able to stay asleep because all of that energy is just too arousing. It's more than the system can tolerate internally. And so obviously, most of the time they wake up and need to adjust for a period of time, hopefully, and in many cases not go back to sleep because, of course, if that happens every time I go to sleep, then by golly, I don't want to go to sleep. So over time, if we don't get some relief there in those kinds of symptoms, in this case, the nightmares, in the evening, a person stops going into REM. They'll actually go into earlier levels of sleep, and then it's like your brain decides, it's too stressful, we're not going to work that out. And so it starts to skip out of REM to where a person will get to a phase where they stop dreaming or they stop recalling anything that they dream. And what you notice at those points is that you find an increased level of depression starting to show up just from the sleep loss part. Because as you can see, right, if level 5 is one of the most restorative phases of sleep and they're not being restored in most normal ways, over time that's going to take a toll. And so if a person's waking up at night, or even if they're sleeping but they're not dreaming because they're not really sleeping deeply, over time that has a depressive effect which begins to heighten the mood, increases exhaustion, and gives adds to the dilemma. So basically, I want to give you another sort of a sense of how it happens, or at least how we think it happens in the brain, because sometimes folks are troubled by how do you explain to somebody this whole reliving experience? Why would it be so intense? Well, there's an interesting brain structure right in the middle of your brain called the thalamus. Now, we're not going to get deep into neurology. I know just enough neurology to be dangerous, so but just bear with me. But the thalamus acts as sort of the center of recognition or conception. When we have a recollection of something, the thalamus operates kind of like the hub of a wagon wheel. It's sort of the hub that pulls in data. And so when our brain decides it's time to either work on something that's tied to a memory while we're sleeping, or we get queued up from a flashback trigger, what happens is the thalamus reaches out electrochemically to all of the different brain areas where things are stored. So it goes back to the occipital lobe and grabs the pictures, goes over the temporal lobes and gets the sound data that goes with this, and then it goes into the somatosensory cortex and gets the physical sensations and the senses of movement, and the olfactory area to where they get the sense of smell. And then the thalamus reaches out and grabs that data and it brings it all together, and it kind of says, here's this picture, or here's this movie that you were trying to remember. So you can see that the reliving or the recall is an active process, and it's with live experiences. And what it goes out to get is it gets neurons, it gets electrical energy, it gets chemical energy, it gets emotional energy, and all of these experiences show up in a moment in both of those conditions, either in flashbacks or in nightmares. And so obviously you can see a person's going along at, so let's just say they were doing essentially okay, they were functioning, and then all of a sudden they have a flashback. Well, now all of a sudden they've had this gigantic increase in intensity in their heart rate and respiration, their pulse, their sweating. They've got all these big emotions that came out of nowhere, and then all of a sudden they've got pictures and sounds and other stuff, and they don't know why this happened. Most of the time, when people ask, when you ask somebody, well, what was it that triggered you? Well, I don't know exactly. I mean, some of them are obvious, but a lot of them are very small, like the shape of a road sign, or a pile of dirt on the side of a road, or something to where they're going along just, doing as well as they could, and it was kind of an okay, I think I'm coping today day, and then they see a pile of dirt on the side of the road, and maybe there's a plastic bottle in that dirt, and the next thing you know, they're swerving the car and pulling around traffic and trying to find some place to get away. So it's a very disturbing and kind of overwhelming experience at the start. But the major point here is that it's actually connected to something that your body is actually trying to protect you. And understanding that means that we can try now to work with your mind and your body to cooperate with that protective factor and begin to utilize some things to make it work easier. So when folks come back on redeployment, we talk about the sense of the new normal, which has a hint of sarcasm for most folks that talk about that, because when somebody comes out of the combat zone, right, everybody's expectation, the service members and the families, everybody thinks, okay, well, this is going to be better now. Thank goodness we're out of this danger zone. We get our spouse back, we get our family back, and things are going to be okay now. Right? Well, that's the hope. And so folks come home anticipating that things are going to be okay. But then all of a sudden, things like these conditions that we're talking about start to kick in. And all of a sudden, it's like, I thought I left the combat zone, but now somehow it's like the combat zone is in my head, and this begins to start to generate other kinds of fears. I'm apprehensive to come home. I love my wife, I love my family, but I'm scared to come home, and I don't know why. I don't understand why I can't stop thinking about this. I don't know why I'm scared to go to the mall. I never liked the mall, but my wife does. So sorry, gender bias, excuse me. But anyway, but I don't want to go there. I don't want to go to a ball game. I had one guy, he said that he used to love baseball, used to go to all the Cardinals games, couldn't go to the games anymore. Couldn't stand it. The only group that he could stand was a very small church they had found just a little ways from their house. And that was small enough and dark enough and quiet enough that he could feel safe there. And that was about the only group of people that he could be in initially. So there's also fears on the service member side of what's my family going to think of me? What are they going to think of me because of what happened, all the stuff they don't necessarily know? But also, what are they going to think of me because now it feels like I'm real different because maybe my mood's off and maybe I'm not sleeping right and, my spouse walked up behind me to give me a hug, and all of a sudden I jumped through the ceiling and got mad because they were offering a gesture of kindness, and now it feels like my family's starting to back up from me, and they're starting to wonder, man, what's wrong with me, and what's changed? It seems like now they're different. It's like my family isn't even the same people that I left. Now, these are fears, okay? And it's very important, at least to me, to identify that as a fear in these conversations right out of the gate, because the service member is still the person they were before they left. Okay? The family is still the family they were before they left. Granted, things have changed. I'm not Pollyanna, but the person is still there. And these experiences they have are a problem, which is different than the person. The person is not the problem. They have a problem, and there may be problems that the family is experiencing and distress, but it's important to point to the idea that we want to get back to a family that we like we used to have together. So, and with that, with the concerns about the changes, there's fears about, am I going to be able to cut it? Am I going to be able to keep working? What if I lose my job? I don't dare to let anybody know that something's going wrong in my head, or they might take my gun away, or they might not let me do any of my job anymore. And it's unfortunate that in many situations I've worked with a number of folks where those kind of concerns actually proved true for a period of time till we were able to get things adjusted. And then, excuse me. As well as that, the things that, you come back home and there's this, hopefully a bit of a honeymoon phase, but then, as we all know, there's a piece of reality that's there that's not positive. Everybody's got financial challenges, right? Kids are in school, they have to do classes, they have grades. Sometimes the grades are not so great. Sometimes things aren't working out quite as well as we'd like in marriage communication. The intimacy's not the same as it was. And all of a sudden it seems like now my friends, the people that were my buddies and colleagues before, when I go back to them, it's like all of a sudden they're looking at me different. And they somehow don't seem to want to be with me. And then the next thing you know, I'm not sure I want to be with them. It just starts to feel a little too weird. And so as these kind of things mount, it's obvious. You could probably, sitting here today, you could probably feel the pressure of what it would be like for a person who's walking through that process, because it's like they can't seem to shed any baggage. They can't get rid of any distress. It's like everything that was distressful still is. Everything new that's distressful is piled on top of that, and it gets too heavy, and they begin to sink. So a lot of this, as folks are experiencing that, is tied up in a process of retraumatization and then mostly avoidance of the re-traumatizing experiences, because it's absolutely unclear to the person who's struggling what to do, because they've already tried everything they know to do, and they've probably asked their buddies, at least a few that they're close to, and they tried their buddies' stuff, and that didn't seem to work. And so over and over again, we've got this experience of trauma and weight and distress that we can't seem to do anything about. And so then what most people do is they just try and find ways to escape. So they stop thinking about it, or they try to. They stop sleeping because they can't stand the nightmares. They stop talking to people because everybody feels too weird. And many get into other kinds of coping behaviors, alcohol, substances, high-risk behaviors, to try and feel something different, feel almost anything that's not this painful, traumatic, or numbing experience. And so it just becomes daunting.
This is not a drill soldier. Not a drill soldier. We're clear on that. This is a live project. Ready to go. Training is over. Training is over. Training is over.
So now that everybody here is completely depressed and wanting to go home or eat lunch or something, where's the hope? Well, that's where we're going now, because partly at this juncture, we have to begin to identify the resources for a person to rely on, people and systems and organizational supports who are there and who can help to begin to unravel this cyclical process. And so initially, we offer that there's hope in the fact that God is there and God cares for them. And we invite folks to try and return to or deepen their spiritual community and their sense of the meaning of life through the spiritual community they've had before, or maybe even developing a new spiritual community. We pose, if a person's interested in this arena, I'll talk in terms of how this treatment model, and actually many others, are very consistent with their faith, and how, in fact, I actually believe that we're tapping into something that God actually designed into the human system as a way to help us recover day to day kind of automatically, and now that we can utilize or borrow from to help that recovery in more extreme situations. We start by reminding them that the families that they loved and cared about that seem different now are still their family, and they still care. And that the family stress does not mean that the family are now unloving people. It means the family's stressed. And we want to try and identify resources to help them with that. We help them identify community resources to show that there are agencies, like many of the agencies here with the VA and the vet centers and other groups of folks that are dedicated to reaching out to service members and families to provide support in all manner of arenas so that they begin to get a sense, though tentatively at first, that they are not alone in this and they don't have to be. And that if they're willing to step out, and usually with the help of a supportive person, either a supportive spouse or a counselor or a friend or a pastor, that you can begin to find recovery and find more supports in more areas to begin to start to unpack this heavy load that is being carried. We obviously are offering hope through the